The air was heavy with the scent of exhaust and faint desperation as Anderon moved through the bustling streets of New York City. His worn boots shuffled over the cracked pavement, and his hands clutched a small bundle of belongings, barely enough to sustain a man for a day, let alone a life. Yet his eyes carried a peculiar glimmer, one that refused to be extinguished by the crushing weight of his circumstances. Anderon wasn't like the others scattered along the sidewalks. Their gazes cast downward as they waited for kindness to find them. He walked with purpose, offering a nod here, a word of encouragement there, even pausing to share the last of his sandwich with a young woman and her toddler huddled in a corner. "You'll be okay," he murmured, his voice steady despite the pang of hunger tightening his stomach. The sun always rises, even after the darkest night. The woman's tearful smile was reward enough. As he stepped away, Anderon's mind replayed 1,000 memories of what life had been before he lost his home, his job, and the family that tethered him to stability. But even in the harsh reality of homelessness, he held on to a sense of purpose, an unwavering belief that helping others could somehow ease the ache of his own solitude. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyscrapers, Anderon settled into his usual spot under the shelter of a dilapidated overpass. It wasn't much, just a few cardboard pieces and a threadbare blanket, but it was his. The chatter of nearby strangers was a faint comfort, a reminder that even in isolation, he wasn't entirely alone. Yet, tonight felt different. As he lay back, staring at the endless expanse of stars visible through gaps in the concrete above, a thought gnawed at him. What if tomorrow held more? What if life still had surprises left for someone like him? The question lingered as Anderon drifted to sleep, unaware that his simple acts of kindness would soon set into motion a chain of events that would alter not only his life, but the lives of those he was yet to meet. The morning air was crisp, carrying the mingled scent of asphalt and fresh bread from a bakery across the street. Anderon stirred awake beneath the overpass, stretching stiff limbs and shaking off the chill that had settled into his bones overnight. He glanced at the sky, its muted colors, a prelude to another day of uncertainty. He gathered his meager belongings and made his way toward the bustling heart of the city. The sidewalks were alive with hurried footsteps, business people with steaming cups of coffee, and delivery trucks unloading their morning wares. Amid the chaos, Anderon's presence was like a stone in a rushing river, steady and unyielding, yet largely unnoticed, except by one. Ben sat on a sleek bench outside a cafe, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone as he sipped an espresso. Dressed in a tailored suit, the young millionaire had every reason to appear content, yet his expression was far from serene. His sharp eyes, framed by dark lashes, drifted away from his screen to the scene across the street, where Anderon was helping a frail elderly man gather his scattered belongings. "Here you go, sir," Anderon said, crouching to lift a tattered bag and placing it gently in the man's trembling hands. Ben watched as Anderon reached into his own pocket and handed over a small pack of crackers. The old man accepted it with a gratitude that made Anderon smile, a soft, fleeting expression that betrayed both weariness and hope. Something about the scene struck a chord in Ben. He stood abruptly, abandoning his coffee as he crossed the street toward Anderon. "Excuse me," Ben called out, his voice firm but polite. Anderon turned, wary but not unkind. He wasn't used to being addressed so directly by men in polished shoes. "Yes?" Anderon replied cautiously. "I saw what you did just now," Ben began, gesturing toward the elderly man hobbling away. "That was kind of you." Anderon shrugged, shifting his weight. He needed help. We all do, in one way or another. Ben studied him for a moment, as if weighing an invisible scale. Finally, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $50 bill, holding it out to Anderon. "Here, get yourself a meal." For a moment, Anderon hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't need the money. He desperately did. But accepting charity from strangers had always felt like a quiet surrender, a step further from the dignity he clung to. Still, something in Ben's earnest expression made him reach out and take the bill. "Thank you," Anderon said, his voice low but sincere. Ben nodded, but instead of walking away, he lingered. "What's your name?" "Anderon." "I'm Ben," he replied, extending a hand. Anderon hesitated again, then shook it. Ben's grip was firm, a contrast to Anderon's roughened, calloused palm. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ben added, I don't usually do this, but if you ever need anything, here's my card." He slipped a business card into Anderon's hand, the embossed text gleaming faintly in the morning light. Anderon looked down at it, unsure of what to say. Before he could form a response, Ben gave a slight smile and a nod, then disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Anderon standing on the sidewalk with the $50 bill and the card clutched in his hand. It wasn't until much later, as Anderon sat in a modest diner with a hot meal before him, that he let the moment sink in. The taste of warm soup and fresh bread filled his senses, a luxury he hadn't allowed himself in months. As he ate, the card on the table seemed to pulse with possibilities, a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. He glanced around the diner, where the faint hum of conversation and clinking cutlery reminded him of a world he once belonged to. Suddenly, an idea struck him, a way to use not just the money, but the gesture behind it. As Anderon left the diner, he made a stop at a nearby grocery store. He bought bread, canned goods, and bottles of water. The $50 bill stretched farther than he expected, leaving him with enough supplies to share. That night, under the same overpass where he slept, Anderon handed out the items to others who shared his plight. "It's not much," he said to a gaunt man with hollow eyes, "but it's something." "Why do this?" the man asked, clutching the loaf of bread. "Because someone reminded me today that kindness doesn't cost much," Anderon replied, his voice steady. As he settled into his spot that night, Anderon's thoughts turned to Ben. Their paths had crossed by chance, yet it felt like the beginning of something much larger, something neither of them could yet imagine. The following day, Anderon woke to the sound of cars rumbling overhead and the faint chatter of the early morning city. His muscles ached from the hard concrete, but his heart felt lighter. The warmth of the soup from the previous night and the echoes of Ben's gesture lingered in his mind like a small ember on a cold night. He looked at the handful of food and water he had left, packed neatly in his worn bag. As the morning passed, Anderon moved with his usual resolve, stopping along familiar streets where the unseen and forgotten gathered. A young woman, pale and shivering, caught his attention as she sat on a park bench, clutching her child tightly to her chest. Anderon approached cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate. "Are you hungry?" he asked softly, holding out a loaf of bread and a bottle of water. The woman's weary eyes darted to the offering, then to her child, before she nodded hesitantly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Anderon smiled faintly, setting the items on the bench beside her. "It's not much, but it'll help." As he turned to leave, she called out, "Wait, why are you helping us?" He paused, considering her question. The memory of Ben's outstretched hand flashed in his mind. "Because someone helped me," he said simply, then walked away. Across town, Ben sat in his corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city's skyline. His desk, a pristine expanse of polished wood, was cluttered with reports and his laptop. Yet his focus was elsewhere. He stared at his phone, scrolling through messages but not reading them. His mind kept drifting back to the man he'd met on the street. There was something different about Anderon. It wasn't just the obvious, the weathered clothes or the hollow cheeks, but the quiet dignity in his voice, the steady way he carried himself despite his circumstances. Ben couldn't shake the feeling that he'd witnessed something rare, something unspoken yet profound. A knock at the door broke his reverie. His assistant, Carla, entered, holding a stack of files. "Mr. Braden, the investor meeting is in 15 minutes. Should I bring in the latest projections?" she asked. Ben blinked, forcing himself to refocus. "Yes, please. And Carla?" "Yes. Clear my schedule for the afternoon." Carla's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Of course." As the meeting dragged on, Ben found himself more distracted than ever. It wasn't like him to lose focus. He prided himself on his sharp instincts and meticulous attention to detail. Yet, Anderon's words, simple and unvarnished, echoed in his mind. We all need help, in one way or another. When the meeting finally ended, Ben slipped out of the office unnoticed, determined to track down the man who had left such an impression on him. Armed with nothing more than his memory of the street corner where they'd met, he drove through the city, scanning the sidewalks and overpasses. It was late afternoon when he finally spotted him. Anderon was sitting near a fountain in a public park, surrounded by a small group of people. In his lap were the remaining groceries he'd purchased, which he was distributing among the others. Ben parked nearby and approached, taking in the scene. There was something magnetic about the way Anderon moved, his presence commanding yet unassuming. The people around him weren't just accepting food, they were listening, nodding, even smiling faintly. "Anderon," Ben called out when he was close enough. The older man looked up, surprised but not startled. "Ben," he said, standing. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Ben gestured toward the small gathering. "Looks like you've been busy." Anderon shrugged, his expression almost sheepish. "Just doing what I can. There are too many people out here who don't have anyone looking out for them." Ben nodded, his admiration growing. "It's incredible, really. Most people would have used that money for themselves." Anderon chuckled dryly. "Oh, I did. I got myself a meal first. Can't help others if you can't stand on your own 2 feet." They stood in silence for a moment, the city bustling around them. Finally, Ben asked, "Have you ever thought about doing more? Helping on a bigger scale?" Anderon tilted his head, a curious smile playing on his lips. "I don't think the world's waiting for a homeless man to save it." Ben's expression turned serious. "Maybe not, but it doesn't mean you can't try. You have something most people don't, a heart that knows what it's like to struggle. That's rare." Anderon looked at him, trying to gauge the sincerity in Ben's words. It was there, plain as day. "What are you getting at?" Anderon asked. Ben smiled. "Just a thought for now. Let me figure it out. But in the meantime, how about dinner? My treat." For the first time in years, Anderon felt an odd flutter of anticipation, as if the gears of his life were finally turning again. "All right," he said, his voice low but steady. "Let's see where this goes." And as the 2 men walked away, a shared meal ahead of them, neither could have guessed the extraordinary events their connection would soon set into motion. Anderon followed Ben into a modest restaurant tucked away in the corner of a busy avenue. The place was unassuming, its charm lying in its simplicity: wooden tables, soft lighting, and the mouth-watering scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. Anderon hesitated briefly at the entrance, brushing his hands nervously against his worn jacket. It had been years since he'd stepped foot into an establishment like this. Ben seemed to notice his unease. "You all right?" he asked, pausing by the host's stand. Anderon nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just not used to places like this anymore." Ben gave him a reassuring look and gestured for them to take a seat. They settled into a quiet corner of the restaurant, the hum of casual conversations around them providing a comforting background. A waiter approached with menus, and Anderon hesitated again, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar list of dishes. "Get whatever you want," Ben said, his tone casual but sincere. "This one's on me." Anderon's fingers grazed the edge of the menu. "Thanks, but maybe something simple. A sandwich, maybe?" Ben smiled faintly, sensing the reluctance behind the words. "How about we both start with the soup? It's great here." Anderon nodded, relieved. As the waiter took their order and disappeared, Ben leaned back in his chair, studying the man across from him. Anderon's face, weathered by time and hardship, carried an air of resilience that Ben found both humbling and intriguing. "So," Ben began, breaking the silence, "you said yesterday that we all need help in one way or another. What kind of help do you need?" Anderon chuckled softly, though there was little humor in it. "A loaded question, don't you think?" "Maybe," Ben admitted, "but I'm serious. What's the one thing that could make a difference for you?" Anderon hesitated, his eyes dropping to the table. The answer seemed so distant, almost unattainable. Finally, he said, "Stability. A place to sleep without worrying about being moved along. Somewhere to catch my breath." Ben nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "Fair enough. Stability's a good start." The waiter returned with steaming bowls of soup, the aroma filling the space between them. Anderon picked up his spoon, the warmth of the broth soothing as he took his first sip. For a moment there was only silence as they ate, the comfort of the meal outweighing the tension of unfamiliarity. When Ben spoke again, his voice was softer, almost hesitant. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about why I stopped for you yesterday." Anderon glanced up, curious. "I guess I saw something in you," Ben continued. "The way you helped that man, even when you didn't have much yourself, it reminded me of something." Anderon tilted his head. "What's that?" Ben hesitated, his gaze distant as if reaching into a memory. "When I was a kid, things weren't always easy for me and my mom. We had our rough patches, and there were days when a kind stranger made all the difference. I guess I never forgot that." Anderon listened intently, the words resonating with an ache he didn't expect. He set his spoon down, his brow furrowing as a thought formed in his mind. "Your mother, what happened to her?" Anderon asked carefully. Ben's expression softened. "She passed when I was in my teens. It was just the two of us for a long time before that, though." The conversation fell quiet again, the weight of shared struggles lingering between them. Anderon broke the silence first, his voice tinged with reflection. "I think kindness like that, it's not something you forget. It stays with you, even when the world gets dark." Ben nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Exactly." As the meal wound down, the waiter brought the check, and Ben paid without a second thought. When they stepped out into the cool evening air, Anderon stuffed his hands into his pockets, his thoughts still lingering on their conversation. "Ben," he said, breaking the quiet. "Thanks for all of this." Ben waved it off. "It's nothing." "No," Anderon pressed, his tone firm. "It's not nothing. Most people don't even look at me, let alone treat me like a person. So, thanks." Ben met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "You're welcome, Anderon." The two parted ways, Ben heading toward his car and Anderon toward the familiar shelter of his overpass. But as Anderon walked, he felt a strange pull, a nagging sensation that he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Fragile, but real. Later that evening, as Anderon sat in his usual spot, a thought struck him. He pulled out the card Ben had given him, running his thumb over the embossed text. The name Ben Braden stood out, along with a phone number and the logo of a prestigious investment firm. Anderon knew better than to expect miracles, but something in him whispered that this connection, however unlikely, could lead to something bigger. He tucked the card back into his pocket, promising himself he'd think about it tomorrow. Meanwhile, across the city, Ben sat in his apartment, his mind racing. That moment with Anderon, talking about his mother, their shared history of hardship, it had stirred something in him he couldn't ignore. He opened his laptop and began typing notes, ideas forming as he considered how to turn this fleeting encounter into something meaningful. What neither man realized was that their stories were already deeply intertwined, connected by a single thread waiting to be unraveled. The days following their dinner passed slowly for Anderon, yet the memory of the encounter lingered like a faint glow in his otherwise monotonous routine. He carried Ben's card with him, tucked securely in the pocket of his jacket, a tangible reminder that his life had been momentarily touched by someone extraordinary. That afternoon, as Anderon shared the last of his bread with a man named Curtis, another regular at the overpass, a new face emerged from the shadows. A wiry older man with sunken cheeks and weary eyes shuffled forward, his clothes hanging loosely from his frame. "You're Anderon, right?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. "The one who gives out food?" Anderon straightened, nodding cautiously. "That's me. You need something?" The man hesitated, his hands twisting nervously. "Not food, just maybe a bit of advice." Anderon motioned for him to sit, listening as the man, who introduced himself as Marvin, spoke about his struggles, debt, estranged family, and the crushing shame of asking for help. As Marvin talked, Anderon's mind wandered to Ben. He thought of the confidence with which Ben had handed him the $50 bill, the way he'd spoken about kindness and second chances. By the time Marvin finished, Anderon had shared what little wisdom he could, offering words of encouragement that seemed to bring the man a faint semblance of peace. Yet as Marvin walked away, Anderon's thoughts lingered. If someone like Ben could see value in him, maybe he could do the same for others, on a larger scale. Across town, Ben sat in his office, staring at the phone on his desk. He had spent the last few nights sketching out ideas, plans that, on paper, seemed idealistic but oddly achievable. Still, doubt gnawed at him. It wasn't the logistics that troubled him. Money could handle that. It was the question of whether he had the right to intervene in someone else's life in such a significant way. The hum of his thoughts was broken by a knock at the door. His father, William Braden, entered without waiting for an invitation. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, William exuded authority and carried an air of impatience that Ben had grown accustomed to over the years. "I hear you've been taking some unusual meetings," William said, lowering himself into a chair across from Ben. Ben leaned back, folding his arms. "What do you mean?" "Dinner with a homeless man, for one," William replied bluntly. "Word travels fast in this city. Ben's jaw tightened. What I do with my time is my business. Of course, William said with a dismissive wave. But don't forget, your name is tied to this company. If you want to play philanthropist, there are better ways to do it than picking up strangers off the street. Ben's fists clenched beneath the desk. You wouldn't understand. Try me, William challenged. Taking a deep breath, Ben explained the encounter with Anderon, his tone growing more passionate with each word. He's not just some stranger. He's someone who's been through hell but still chooses to help others. That's rare, Dad. That's worth something. William's expression softened slightly, though skepticism remained. And what exactly are you planning to do? I don't know yet, Ben admitted. But I know I want to do something real, something that matters. For a moment, William said nothing. Then rising from his chair, he placed a firm hand on Ben's shoulder. Just be careful, son. The world doesn't reward idealism. As William left, Ben sat in silence, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. But instead of discouraging him, they ignited a spark of defiance. He grabbed his phone and dialed Anderon's number, his heart pounding as it rang. That evening, Anderon sat by the fountain in the park, staring at the glowing screen of a cheap cell phone Curtis had given him in exchange for a spare blanket. The number on the display was unfamiliar, but something told him to answer. Anderon speaking, he said hesitantly. It's Ben, came the reply. Anderon straightened, a mix of surprise and curiosity flooding him. Ben, didn't think I'd hear from you again. Ben's voice was steady, but there was a hint of urgency. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about stability and helping others. I think we could do something together, something meaningful. Anderon frowned, unsure of what to make of the proposition. What kind of something are we talking about? Meet me tomorrow, Ben said. I'll explain everything. The next day they met in a small cafe downtown. Ben arrived first, seated at a table near the window, a briefcase resting at his feet. When Anderon walked in, the contrast between them was stark. Ben in a crisp shirt and slacks, Anderon in his weathered coat and scuffed boots. Yet, as they sat across from each other, the divide seemed to shrink. Ben opened the briefcase, pulling out a stack of papers. I've been working on this, he began, sliding the documents across the table. A foundation for people like you, like us. It'll provide shelter, resources, and most importantly, a second chance. Anderon stared at the papers, his mind struggling to grasp the scale of what Ben was proposing. You're serious? Dead serious, Ben replied. But I need your help. You've lived it. You know what people need, how to reach them. I can't do this without you. Anderon leaned back, his heart racing. It was too much, too fast. But then he thought of Marvin, of Curtis, of all the people he'd met who deserved better than the hand life had dealt them. Finally, he nodded. All right, Ben, let's see where this goes. Ben smiled, relief washing over him. You won't regret this, Anderon, I promise. What neither of them realized was that this partnership, born of a simple act of kindness, would soon uncover a truth that would bind their lives in ways they could never have imagined. Weeks passed, and the foundation began to take shape. Ben's resources and connections expedited what would have taken years under normal circumstances. He rented a building in a quieter part of the city, sturdy but worn, much like the people it was meant to serve. With Anderon's guidance, they began transforming the space into a sanctuary for those in need. Anderon was reluctant at first, his self-doubt a constant companion. He wasn't used to being at the center of anything, let alone a project of this magnitude. But as the days went by, his determination grew. He saw the potential for change in every small detail. A freshly painted wall, a repaired ceiling, a warm meal served with dignity. One afternoon, Anderon stood in the foundation's kitchen, unpacking donated groceries. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air as volunteers bustled around him, their chatter a comforting backdrop. He paused, watching as a young woman helped her son carry a box of supplies to the pantry. The sight tugged at something deep within him, memories of a life he hadn't revisited in years. Hey, Anderon, Ben's voice cut through the moment. He entered the kitchen with a folder in hand, his expression a mix of excitement and exhaustion. Got a minute? Anderon nodded, wiping his hands on a towel. What's up? Ben handed him the folder. Grant applications. If we land these, we could expand faster, get more beds, more staff, better facilities. Anderon flipped through the pages, the sheer volume of legalese making his head spin. This is a lot. I know, Ben admitted, but we're making progress. And we're not alone. People are noticing what we're doing. Anderon raised an eyebrow. People, huh? Like who? Ben smirked. The good kind. Donors, city officials, even a few reporters. They want to hear your story, Anderon. The thought made Anderon's stomach tighten. He set the folder down, shaking his head. I'm not sure about all that. I'm not exactly the poster boy for inspiration. Ben placed a hand on his shoulder. You're exactly that. People need to see the real side of this, the humanity behind the statistics. You're the heart of this foundation, Anderon. Don't forget that. As evening fell, Anderon returned to his familiar spot under the overpass, the noise of the city replaced by a hushed calm. He sat with Curtis, who had come to see him as a trusted friend and confidant. So, you're a big shot now, Curtis teased, his grin exposing a missing tooth. Anderon chuckled, shaking his head. Not even close. Curtis grew serious. You're doing good, though. Real good. Makes the rest of us feel like maybe things can get better. Anderon glanced at him, surprised by the admission. He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused, yet capable of creating something meaningful. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of pride. Meanwhile, Ben sat in his penthouse apartment, poring over the foundation's growing list of needs and expenses. His focus was interrupted by a knock at the door. He opened it to find his father, William, holding a bottle of whiskey. Thought I'd stop by, William said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Ben sighed, closing the door. What's this about, Dad? William set the bottle on the counter and turned to face his son. I heard about the building, the foundation. Looks like you're making a name for yourself. It's not about me, Ben said, crossing his arms. It's about them, people who've been forgotten. William studied him for a moment before nodding. All right, I respect that. The words caught Ben off guard. You do? I do, William replied. But you're walking a fine line, Ben. Charity is one thing. Letting it consume you is another. Ben's jaw tightened. I'm not letting it consume me. I'm doing what I think is right. William gave a small smile. Good. Just make sure you don't forget where you came from. As William left, Ben felt a mix of frustration and determination. He returned to his desk, his mind racing with ideas for the foundation's future. What he didn't realize was how deeply his father's words had planted seeds of doubt, and how those doubts would soon resurface. The following day, Anderon invited his father, Chris, to see the foundation for the first time. Chris hadn't spoken much about Anderon's efforts, but his curiosity had grown too strong to ignore. As they walked through the building, Anderon explained its purpose, his voice filled with a quiet pride that hadn't been there before. When they reached the kitchen, Chris stopped abruptly. His eyes landed on a framed photograph hanging on the wall, a picture of Ben shaking hands with a young Anderon outside an old shelter. The memory hit Chris like a bolt of lightning. Anderon, Chris said, his voice shaking. Where did you get that photo? Anderon frowned, confused. Ben had it. He said it was from when he was a kid, volunteering with his mom. Chris's face paled, his hands trembling as he reached for the photo. That's me. And you. I'd forgotten this even happened. What do you mean? Anderon asked, his voice edged with concern. Chris swallowed hard, the weight of a long-buried memory surfacing. Years ago, when we were struggling, there was a boy and his mother. They helped us when we had nothing. That boy, it was Ben. The room seemed to tilt, the connection too staggering to comprehend. Anderon stared at his father, the implications unraveling in his mind. Are you sure? Anderon whispered. Chris nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. I'd know that face anywhere. And now, after all these years, it's come full circle. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the realization hanging heavy in the air. What had seemed like a chance encounter between Anderon and Ben was far more than that. It was destiny, a thread woven through time, tying their lives together in ways they never imagined. Anderon stood frozen in the quiet kitchen, staring at the photograph in his father's trembling hands. The revelation felt surreal, as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. He searched Chris's face for any sign of uncertainty, but his father's expression was resolute. You're saying Ben? He's the same boy who helped us? Anderon's voice was thick with disbelief. Chris nodded, his eyes glistening. Yes, it's him. I can't believe I didn't recognize him sooner. Anderon's mind raced. The boy from so many years ago, the one who, alongside his mother, had offered them food and a place to rest when they had nothing, was now the man helping him rebuild his life. It felt almost impossible to fathom. I need to talk to him, Anderon said suddenly, his voice filled with urgency. Later that evening, Anderon found himself pacing in front of the Foundation's main office. He clutched his phone in one hand, Ben's number glowing on the screen. After a moment of hesitation, he pressed the call button. Ben answered on the second ring. Anderon, everything okay? I need to see you, Anderon said, his voice tight. It's important. There was a pause on the other end before Ben replied, All right, meet me at the cafe in 20 minutes. When Ben arrived, Anderon was already seated at a corner table, his fingers drumming nervously against the wood. The cafe was quiet, the soft hum of conversation blending with the clinking of dishes. Ben slid into the seat across from him, his brow furrowed with concern. What's going on? Ben asked, leaning forward. Anderon hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo he had taken of the framed image at the Foundation. He slid it across the table. Do you recognize this? Anderon asked. Ben picked up the phone, studying the photo. His expression softened as a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Yeah, that's from when my mom and I volunteered at the shelter. I was, 10, 12, maybe? Anderon nodded slowly. Do you remember who you helped that day? Ben frowned, the question catching him off guard. Not really. It was a long time ago. Why? Anderon leaned forward, his voice low but steady. It was me and my dad. You and your mom. You saved us. Ben's jaw dropped slightly, his eyes widening in disbelief. Wait, you're serious? Yes, Anderon said, his voice growing firmer. My dad recognized you. He remembered everything, the food, the place to stay. It was you. Ben leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as the weight of Anderon's words settled in. That's unbelievable. Believe it, Anderon said, his tone tinged with emotion. Because of you, we made it through one of the hardest times in our lives. And now, here we are. Ben was quiet for a long moment, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and awe. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Anderon replied. But I needed you to know. What you and your mom did, it mattered. It still matters. Ben's gaze met Anderon's, a mixture of gratitude and humility shining in his eyes. Anderon, I had no idea. I mean, my mom always said kindness had a way of coming back, but this is something else. They sat in silence for a while, the enormity of the revelation creating an unspoken bond between them. Finally, Ben broke the silence. Do you think your dad would want to meet me? He asked hesitantly. Anderon nodded. I think he'd like that. The following day, Ben arrived at the Foundation, a nervous energy coursing through him. Anderon greeted him at the door, leading him to a small office where Chris was waiting. When Ben entered, Chris rose from his chair, his eyes filling with recognition. You're Ben, Chris said, his voice wavering. I'd know you anywhere. Ben extended a hand, but Chris pulled him into a firm embrace instead. For a moment, neither spoke, the room heavy with emotion. When they finally parted, Chris looked at Ben with a mixture of pride and gratitude. I don't know if I ever thanked you properly, Chris said. You and your mom. You gave us hope when we didn't have any. Ben smiled softly, his voice tinged with emotion. She always believed in helping people. I'm just glad it made a difference. As they sat together, Chris shared stories of their struggles during that time, filling in gaps that Ben had long forgotten. The conversation was bittersweet, a reminder of how far they had all come and how small acts of kindness could ripple through time. Later that evening, as Anderon and Ben stood outside the Foundation, the city lights casting a warm glow around them, Anderon turned to Ben. This Foundation, everything we're doing, it's bigger than either of us, Anderon said. It's about people. It's about giving back what we've been given. Ben nodded, his gaze fixed on the bustling streets. You're right, and I think we've only just begun. Neither of them could have predicted what was to come, the challenges, the triumphs, and the profound impact their partnership would have. But in that moment, they stood united, two lives forever intertwined by the invisible threads of kindness and fate. The Foundation's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Over the weeks, the building that once echoed with emptiness became alive with the sounds of hope. Families sat together in the common areas, children's laughter filled the halls, and warm meals were served daily. Volunteers poured in, drawn by the stories of Anderon and Ben, their unlikely partnership a symbol of resilience and redemption. Despite the progress, Anderon found himself grappling with a mix of emotions. On the one hand, he felt immense pride in the work they were doing. On the other, the weight of his past seemed heavier than ever, each success a stark reminder of the years he'd spent barely surviving. One evening, Anderon was in the office when Ben arrived, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on Anderon's desk and took a seat across from him. "You've been quiet lately," Ben observed. "Everything all right?" Anderon shrugged, cradling the coffee in his hands. "Just thinking. About how far I've come," Anderon admitted, "and how far I still have to go. This place is incredible, but sometimes I wonder if I really belong here." Ben frowned. "Of course you belong here. None of this would have happened without you." Anderon shook his head. "It's not that simple. People look at me and see a success story, but I still feel like the same guy sleeping under an overpass." Ben leaned forward, his voice firm. "You're more than that, Anderon. You're proof that change is possible, and people need to see that, because if you can do it, maybe they can too." Anderon looked at Ben, the sincerity in his words cutting through the doubt. He nodded slowly, a flicker of determination reigniting in his chest. As the foundation's reputation grew, so did its reach. Donors contributed generously, and city officials began to take notice. With the influx of resources, Ben and Anderon decided to expand their efforts, opening satellite shelters in neighboring districts. At one of the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, Anderon stood beside Ben, flanked by volunteers and local leaders. Cameras flashed, and reporters called out questions, their attention fixed on the 2 men who had become the face of the foundation. One journalist stepped forward, her notepad poised. "Mr. Braden, Mr. James, what drives you to continue this work?" Ben started to answer but paused, glancing at Anderon. "You take this one," he said with a smile. Anderon hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then he cleared his throat and stepped closer to the microphone. "I do this because I've been there," Anderon began, his voice steady. "I know what it's like to feel invisible, to think the world's forgotten you. But I also know how far a little kindness can go. This foundation, it's not just about food or shelter. It's about reminding people that they matter, that they're not alone." The crowd erupted into applause, the emotion in Anderon's words resonating deeply. Ben clapped him on the back, his pride evident. "You're a natural," Ben said as they stepped away from the cameras. "Don't get used to it," Anderon replied with a grin. But as the foundation flourished, not everyone was supportive. Behind closed doors, whispers of skepticism and jealousy began to surface. Some questioned Ben's motivations, labeling his philanthropy a vanity project. Others doubted Anderon's ability to sustain his role, pointing to his lack of formal education and professional experience. The criticism reached its peak during a board meeting, where a particularly vocal donor voiced his concerns. "With all due respect," the man said, his tone clipped, "is it wise to place so much responsibility on someone with Anderon's background? This foundation is too important to risk on sentimentality." The room fell silent, tension crackling in the air. Anderon's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Ben spoke up. "Anderon's background is exactly why he's the right person for this," Ben said, his voice sharp. "He understands what it means to struggle, to rebuild from nothing. That's something you can't teach, and it's what makes this foundation real." The donor looked unconvinced, but he didn't push further. After the meeting, Anderon pulled Ben aside. "You didn't have to do that," Anderon said quietly. "Yes, I did," Ben replied, "because you've earned your place here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That night, as Anderon walked through the foundation, he paused in the common area. A group of children were huddled together playing a board game, their laughter filling the space. Nearby, a woman folded laundry while chatting with another resident. The scene was simple but profound, a testament to how far they'd come. Anderon thought of his father's words, of the photo that had sparked so much reflection. He thought of Ben, of the boy who had once helped him survive, and the man who now stood beside him as an equal. And for the first time in years, Anderon felt at peace. Not because his journey was over, but because he finally believed he was on the right path. Months turned into a year, and the foundation became a beacon of hope, not just for those it served, but for the city at large. Stories of lives transformed poured in, families reunited, individuals finding jobs, and children excelling in school. The foundation's work had become a symbol of what was possible when kindness and determination met. Anderon had grown into his role as a leader, his once hesitant voice now carrying the weight of authority and compassion. Yet, there was one part of his past he hadn't fully addressed: the pain of losing his connection to his son, who had been taken into the foster system during his darkest days. One evening, Anderon was sitting in the foundation's office, sorting through a stack of mail, when Ben walked in, a manila envelope in hand. "You've got something," Ben said, handing it over. Anderon frowned, tearing the envelope open. Inside was a letter, the words causing his breath to hitch. "It's from my son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ben sat down, his expression curious but cautious. "What does it say?" Anderon read aloud, his voice trembling. "Dad, I've been following the work you're doing. I didn't know where you were for so long, but now I see you've been out there helping others. I want to meet you, if you'll let me." Tears welled in Anderon's eyes as he folded the letter. "I didn't think this day would ever come." Ben placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've earned this, Anderon. Go meet him." The reunion was arranged for the following weekend at a quiet park outside the city. When Anderon arrived, he spotted a young man standing by a bench, his posture stiff but his face familiar. It was like looking into a mirror of his younger self. "Thomas," Anderon said softly, his voice breaking. The young man turned, his eyes filling with emotion. "Dad." They embraced, the years of pain and separation dissolving in that single moment. For hours they talked, sharing stories of what had been and what could be. Thomas spoke of his struggles in the foster system, and Anderon shared his journey from the streets to the foundation. By the time they parted, Anderon felt a sense of completeness he hadn't known was possible. He promised Thomas they'd never lose touch again. Back at the foundation, Ben was waiting with Chris when Anderon returned. The look on Anderon's face told them everything. "How'd it go?" Chris asked, his voice thick with emotion. "It was perfect," Anderon said, his smile wide and genuine. "I have my son back." In the months that followed, the foundation continued to thrive. Anderon and Thomas worked together to create programs for children in the foster system, while Ben focused on securing funding for long-term initiatives. The bond between Anderon and Ben deepened, their shared history a constant reminder of how interconnected their lives had become. One evening, as they stood outside the foundation, watching the lights glow warmly in the windows, Ben turned to Anderon. "You know," Ben said, "if my mom could see this, she'd be proud." Anderon smiled, his gaze distant. "I think she'd be proud of you." "And of you," Ben replied firmly. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of their journey heavy yet comforting. Anderon looked at the building, the people inside, and the city beyond. He thought of his father, his son, and Ben's mother, of all the lives that had touched his own. "We did it, didn't we?" Anderon asked, his voice quiet. Ben nodded. "Yeah, we did." And as the foundation's doors remained open, welcoming those in need, Anderon and Ben knew one truth above all. Kindness had brought them together, and it would continue to ripple outward, transforming lives in ways they could never imagine.